Well, welcome to Perspectives Matter. I'm Dennis McCuistion, and thanks for joining us. And please stay awake because the subject is that phenomenon known as woke. You've heard of it, but do you really understand it? Didn't think so. But by the time this program is over, you'll not only know what it is, you'll either love it or hate it. And here to help us is Joanna Williams. She's an author, academic, columnist for the British online publication Spiked and for the Times of London. Her most recent books are How Woke Won and Women versus Feminism. Joanna is currently a visiting fellow at the Matthias Corvinus Collegium in Budapest, Hungary, and she runs her own platform, KERA. Now, Joanna, welcome to the program. I hope things are good in Budapest, are they?
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be with you, though. Thank you very much for having me.
I'm going to ask you in just a minute to sort of give us your thinking about what woke is, because that's the key. And I would say in reading your book, it seems like it took a chapter or two to sort of get to what it is. So, but as you know, Joanna, I live in France now, and the French just put a new word in their dictionary last week. They call it wokisme. I hope I'm saying that right. But here's what they say it is: a school of thought originating in the U.S. in the 2000s, advocating the raising of awareness of the inequalities in Western societies, especially of a racist, sexist, or homophobic nature. Now, I don't think you necessarily agree with all that, so give us your thoughts.
So I actually disagree with every single element of that definition, because if that was all that woke meant, just raising awareness about sexual, racial inequalities, I'd be all for it. I'd be the most woke person that there is. But I'm not. I really disagree with woke. For one thing, I think it's not about raising awareness. It's about quite an authoritarian imposition meant to change the way that we speak to each other, the way we relate to each other, and quite fundamentally, the way that we structure our society. And it's not about raising awareness about inequality. It's a particular view on inequality. So if you take racism, for example, I think racism is abhorrent. I think there are a few things that are worse than racism, but that's why I think it's important to be colorblind, to not judge people by the color of their skin, but judge them by the content of their character. But woke people say that you should see color. You should divide people into different groups based on the color of their skin and recognize that white people have white privilege and black people are oppressed. And I think that fundamentally entrenches racialized thinking within society in a very harmful way.
Well, you have quoted, obviously, Martin Luther King, and even though you're a British writer who's in Budapest, your book, I think, probably has more about the wokeness of America than it does have in Britain and some of Europe. So that particular situation didn't just come about in a vacuum. Give us, let's focus now, let's keep focusing on the racist side of this thing. How did this thing sort of come about? Give us some perspective, if you will, on how we got to where we are right now.
If you go back to Martin Luther King's definition, essentially it seems to me that what the civil rights movement was arguing for was legal equality, that people are treated the same under the law, that the law has no regard for a person's skin color. And I think that's a really important principle. I think that's exactly as it should be. We should all have equal rights. But the problem was that when equal rights under the law had been achieved, there was still inequalities in society. So this is where you got this idea around critical race theory that has really fed into woke thinking, that it's not enough to have legal equality. We need to start changing the way that racism exists in people's minds, and we need to actually start changing the way that people actually think, change the language that people use, so that there are correct ways of speaking and referring to people, changing the books that people read, changing the images that people see. And that it's only by changing every part of society, right down to the core of our brains, that we can actually tackle racism. But I think this is fundamentally wrong. I think it really reinforces racism and actually makes people racist to go around constantly judging people by the color of their skin.
Okay, well, let me push back on you a bit and give you the perspective, it seems to me, from the other side. And they're saying, legal equality wasn't enough. We still have these outcomes that are significantly different, the inequalities, so to speak. And if we are not proactive in making changes there, that just because the whites already have so much privilege, we need to find a way to catch up and to use not just legal means, but cultural means as well to get sort of even. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think there certainly are inequalities, but the way I see it is that these inequalities that we have nowadays are much more linked to social class than they are to skin color. So, for example, if you take people like Barack and Michelle Obama, I think most Black people have very little in common. Barack and Michelle Obama have absolutely vast wealth and completely out of all league of most people in society. So the idea that skin color is the deciding factor that makes some people have more and other people have less, I think is just not true. But the woke people, it seems to me, have a real blind spot when it comes to social class. So again, if you take white people, the idea that we're one homogenous group where we're all uniquely privileged, I think is just bizarre. Some white people are incredibly poor and really struggling, and they have much more in common with Black people who are also poor and struggling than they do with rich white people who are running multinational corporations and running countries.
You have put a lot of the blame for the whole woke movement, so to speak, but particularly the racist side, on academics. And there's a lot of, let's just say, people here who criticize academia for a lot of reasons. Being left-wing, as an example, there are certainly more Democrats in academia than there are Republicans, just to name one factual situation. How important is academia to the ideas we're talking about here?
I think it's extremely important, and I think a lot of these ideas emerged from within universities. And that's another point at which I disagree with that French definition, because I don't think you can just say all these ideas came over from America in 2000s. I think they're much more deep-rooted than that, and I think they can be traced back to what was going on in universities, particularly in France, in Germany as well, going right back to the time in the middle of the last century, at the end of the Second World War, where there was a real critique of Marxism on the one hand and capitalism on the other hand, that centered inequality much more within people and started to problematize things like language and focus much more on ideas and the way we communicate, the images, the things we watch, even adverts, rather than actual material circumstances of people's lives. And like I say, I think that can be traced back to universities, especially universities in France. But it's really taken off. And I think the situation you're describing, where far more people in universities lean to the left nowadays, or are Democrats in the US, this speaks to a real groupthink, a real intellectual conformity and political conformity that you've got within universities. And this is where in the UK, this is 50% of our young people now go on to university. And my worry is that they're essentially being brainwashed. And I say that as somebody who spent 12 years of her life working within a university. So I know exactly what goes on in those institutions.
Okay, well, you mentioned something called Marxism. And one of the things that we hear in America from, let's just say, journalists and others who are talking about, I say more anti-woke than woke. Seems like that's used more from the right to say anti-woke than it is from the left to say we're woke. You mentioned Karl Marx, and a lot of people have a tendency to say Marxism is the same as this woke thing. You take issue with that. Tell us why.
For one thing, it just seems to me that it's too easy. And I guess the academic in me always shies away from arguments that I think are a bit easy. And I think just saying, oh, this is communism or this is Marxism it's too much of a slur. It's too easy an insult. But more precisely, exactly as I was saying earlier about the importance of class, social class and class-based inequalities, the difference between people who are struggling to get by on 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs compared to people who have vast salaries. For me, that's the big dividing line in society. That's the big area of inequality. And that's what Marxism focuses upon. Marxism is all about class differences between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, between people who have to sell their labour and people who own the means of production. And yet the woke and the anti-woke people as well have no time for any of that analysis. So I think it's a real slur on Marxism to say that Marxism is just the same as woke.
You mentioned the idea of identity a lot. So explain to that viewer what you mean by identity and how that particularly differentiates from the whole idea of class differences.
Yeah, absolutely. So identity, I think, is really at the heart of woke. And I guess a quick definition for me is that woke is identity politics, combined with an extreme form of political correctness. And by identity, I guess what I mean is the basic facts of a person's life that it seems to me we have absolutely no control over. So my job, I chose where I live. I chose to get married, to have children. All of those things I chose to do as an adult. But my skin color, the fact that I'm female, I had absolutely no choice over those things whatsoever. That was more to do with my parents than to do with me. And yet the woke people, the people who have this big focus on identity, think that my sex and my skin color are the most important things about me, that they determine everything that there is to do with me, that they tell you all you need to know about me. But I actually think they're the most boring bit of who I am. I think that the decisions I've made and the choices I've made about my life are far more interesting. But the identity politics people, they focus on these features which we have no control over.
Well, it was interesting because I saw an article here. It says the clock is ticking, but Slate, the writer, magazine, I should say, as a buzzer beater entry in the contest for the worst article written about the election here in America. One of the Slate writers said they delivered a column about J.D. Vance's wife in which she expresses outrage that Usha Vance's allegiances, I quote now, are not to her race, her gender, the community she was born into. Instead, they are to her husband. Hear me out, but I think racial allegiance is bad while allegiance to your spouse is good. Crazy, I know. So is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Absolutely, yes. And we're seeing this an awful lot in the UK right now. So we've just got a new leader of a Conservative Party, a woman called Kemi Badenoch, a Nigerian heritage Black woman. Personally, I think she's absolutely brilliant. I think what she stands for is fantastic. Again, I think her skin colour, the fact that she's female, is irrelevant to me. What's most important is what she believes, what principles she has, what policies she's suggesting for the future of the UK. But she gets, because she's not woke, and she criticises the woke identity worldview, she gets criticised so much, far above and beyond the criticism that politicians normally receive. And the accusation is that she's being a traitor to her race, that she's not showing allegiance or doing favours for Black people. But I think that's a really disgusting and racist argument, because essentially what it's saying is that the way we think and the way we should act should be defined by the colour of our skin. That's so insulting. It suggests that we are not intelligent human beings who have all kinds of loyalties and allegiances, as you say, but are also quite capable of having independent thoughts that are not determined by our biology.
Well, speaking of biology, let's move to the gender issue. I I was blown away when I read your book about, did I see something in here that somebody claims there are 150 different genders or something? I mean, give us, make some sense out of this for me, would you?
Well, the number 150, I mean, you've got to bear in mind, I wrote the book a couple of years ago, so it's probably over 1,000 by now. It goes up all the time. But this idea is at the heart of so many issues nowadays. And I actually think this had an awful lot of sway in deciding the outcome of the US election that you guys have just had. This is the idea that sex, your biology, is irrelevant, and actually what's important is what goes on in our head in terms of our gender, a gender identity. So if I have a woman's body, but in my brain I feel like I'm a man, I should come onto your program and I should say, thank you very much for having me this evening. My name is Joanna or whatever. My pronouns are he, him. And even though your eyes and your ears are telling you that I'm female, if I say my pronouns are he, him, you should just accept that I'm a man. And likewise, I should just accept that you're a woman if you tell me you're a woman. And that should give you access to women's changing rooms, women's prisons, women's sports, women's bathrooms. You know, there should be no segregation based on sex, purely based on gender. And this is having horrific consequences for girls' sports, for women's safety in public places. And I think this is where woke really fails. It hits this like a reality check where the vast majority of very sensible people, parents, for example, are looking at their little girls and thinking, no, I want to be able to send my daughter to a public bathroom or to go off and play a game of basketball just with other girls. You know, I don't expect there to be boys wearing dresses who call themselves girls in this situation. You know, this is a reality of parents and people the world over.
Okay, well, let me push back on you again for the different perspective. They're going to say to you and to me and to the people around them, in particular their doctors and their schools, they're going to say, especially, let's talk about children these days, anywhere from 6 years old, let's say, to late teenagers. They're saying that, you know, I just feel this other way. I need to have not only feel that way, but I need to have operations that make me look that way and all of that. Where is this on this scale of wokeism we're talking about?
Well, I think this is a really extreme form of wokeism, and it's another reason why I'm completely against it. Because essentially, what we're doing is we're taking healthy children, normal, healthy children with normal, healthy, beautiful bodies, and we are butchering them under the name of medical science. The idea that my beautiful daughter would have part of her body amputated or, you know, other bits stuck onto her body when there's absolutely nothing physically wrong with her, there's no need for this to happen at all, I think would be it's the most horrific thing I can think of. I think the message we need to be saying to our children is, your body is beautiful and wonderful and powerful. It can run, it can jump, it can do anything you want it to do. Don't go around cutting your body up. I think the other message, and this is where I think, again, I really have a problem with woke, because I think it reinforces sexism. When I was growing up, I mean, I'm obviously getting quite old now, perhaps, but when I was growing up, the message I was told as a young girl was that, you know, you can do anything you want to do. Being a girl doesn't hold you back. You know, when I was growing up in the UK, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. You can be Prime Minister, you can do anything you want and still be a girl. You can wear trousers and still be pants, I should say, and still be a girl. But now the message seems to be precisely the opposite. We seem to be saying to girls, well, if you like playing sport and climbing trees and rough and tumble, perhaps you're a boy and you need to go and have an operation and have your breasts cut off. And we're saying to young boys, oh, you like ballet dancing and knitting and crafts and sitting quietly. perhaps you're a girl, perhaps you need to have an operation and start pumping your body with hormones. And I think this just really reinforces sexism, which I actually thought was long gone.
Well, I think that's one of the things that was most important to me in reading your book is it seemed like all the legitimate things that people worry about in terms of race and sex and gender and things have sort of been swept away by the tide of going all the way to what you're calling woke. And so how do we, as mere individuals who are not so much aware of this, how do we react to other people, and how do we know what's, I hate to use the word what's true and what's not true, but certainly that's one of the issues. And in your book, if I may quote from page 202, something that I found particularly interesting, you were talking about racism, and you said that knowledge itself and racism can be identified everywhere. It supposedly exists within our unconscious mind and becomes real with our every utterance. The only solution then is for people to submit to the superior insight of activist scholars who are apparently uniquely capable of revealing white privilege. In this way, a movement founded upon relativism and the idea that there's no truth comes to the conclusion that there is the truth according to social justice, and that this is a truth that cannot, under any circumstances, be questioned. Oh my God, when I read that, Joanna.
No, well, I think I still stand by that a couple of years on. And I think the important thing is that deep down inside, if we know ourselves that we are not racist, we're not sexist, then we should tell the people who come along and say, well, if you don't declare your pronouns, if you don't let men into women's bathrooms, if you don't confess to your white privilege, then you're racist and sexist. I think we need to tell those people very politely where to go and that they're talking rubbish, because if we know deep down inside that we're not racist and we're not sexist and our intentions are good, for me, I think having good intentions is far, far more important than somebody who knows all the correct vocabulary to use and knows all the latest woke terminology, can name every one of those 500 different genders. I'd far rather go and hang out with somebody who was just a good person than somebody who could recite a list of all the different genders.
Right. You mentioned something a few minutes ago. It was on the last few minutes of the program. We just had an election here a couple of weeks ago, and Donald Trump was reelected president, as you know, and he'll be sworn in a couple of months. There have been a bunch of articles, some of which I sent to you, some of which you've seen of yourself, of people who are basically saying that one of the real reasons for his reelection and the, let's say, the rejection of Kamala Harris and her thinking was that this was really a rejection of this whole woke thing. Your thoughts about that?
Well, I agree with that. I think that's absolutely true. And again, it's what I was saying earlier about almost a reality check on woke. When it meets the ballot box, time and time again, regular voters reject it. I think people are not stupid. People see this woke movement for the very elitist, very condescending, very academic project that it is, and they see that people are I don't know about pretending, maybe that's too harsh, but people are displaying their virtue because they know the right words to use, they know the right terminology, but actually people know that it doesn't make them a good person. And as I was saying, people know that when they send their daughter off to the bathroom or to play sport, they want to know, they know it's just common sense that you have bathrooms as women-only spaces and men-only spaces. And so when you have people, I think the Trump advert, that it seems to me really won it for him. I'm probably going to quote it badly. I'm sure your viewers are much more familiar with it than I am. But there was a line, I'm sure, where it said that Kamala Harris is for they, them, and Trump is for you.
Yes.
And I think for me, that would be the number one, whoever came up with that line, I think it's brilliant. And it really sums up the woke thinking so neatly in so few words. And I think that has this reality check factor where they think, yes, Kamala Harris is for these gender fluid people who want men to go in women's bathrooms. Actually, I want somebody who speaks to me and my need for a decent economy, a good job, to be able to afford it, to buy enough groceries for my family.
You wrote this book, and it was called How Woke Won. So I ask you, the name of this program, is woke still winning? Yes or no?
It's a very good question, and I don't know the answer. I change my mind every single day, and I have sleepless nights trying to work out whether I've got this right or wrong. I think when we put woke thinking before the electorate, I think it's massively rejected, and woke clearly hasn't won. And I think your US election result is a really good illustration of that. My concern is that we still have an awful lot of woke people in the institutions, in schools, in universities, in many branches of the mainstream media, in the film industry. And these people have a lot of social and a lot of cultural power. So I hope woke is on the way out. I hope it's been dealt a really big blow with Trump's victory. But I think we can't rest on our laurels if we want to kind of get rid of this damaging racist, sexist ideology once and for all. We still have a bit more work to do.
Thank you, Joanna. We appreciate that, and thank you for joining us. The University of Austin, we just did a program on that. You mentioned it in your book as a university that's doing great thinking. We are talking about perspectives that matter because we always talk about things that matter with people who care. So thank you for joining us.